Hello, everyone. I am very honored to introduce Professor Bruce Ackerman, who has kindly agreed to make a presentation and answer some questions in light of the severe constitutional crisis that Peru has suffered in recent days. Professor Ackerman is a starting professor of law and political science at Yale and the author of 19 books in political philosophy, constitutional law, and public policy. His major works include Social Justice in the Liberal State, that continues to provoke contemporary controversy, and his multi-volume Constitutional History with the People. His scholarship has had a global impact across the world, and in my view, Professor Ackerman is the most influential constitutionalist of the world. Good afternoon, Professor Ackerman. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. How are you today?
I am fine, thank you. I hope I could be, I don't think I'm going to be equal to your introduction, but I'll give it a try.
Thank you, I'm glad to hear that. Well, we know that you are quite pressed for time due to the Biden transition and very busy with your scholarship agenda. We are all looking forward to reading your book number 20. Well, as you know, these are difficult times for Peru, not only because of the pandemic, but also because we have been facing a very severe constitutional crisis. Former President Martin Vizcarra was impeached by Congress because he allegedly received bribes from some construction companies when he was governor of the province of Moquegua. Former President of Congress, Manuel Merino, assumed the presidency by succession, a person who got a seat in Congress with only 5,000 votes. This triggered an immediate reaction from the population. Protesters, opposition parties, and civil society called Vizcarra's impeachment coup d'etat and refused to recognize Merino as the new president. After nearly a week of protests and the deaths of two innocent young people, Inti and Brian, who were peacefully exercising their constitutional right to protest, may them rest in peace, Manuel Merino resigned after being in office only 5 days. 2 days ago, Francisco Sagasti of the Purple Party was sworn in as president. In short, we have had 3 presidents in 1 week. In light of these facts, I would like to ask you a few questions and also share with you some questions of con law, constitutional law professors who have asked me to tell you that they are big fans. But first of all, I would like to give you the floor for 10 minutes so you can provide us an overview about the presidential models in Peru and the United States and analyze whether or not Peru should elect a constituent assembly to consider the need for a transformation of its system of government. Professor Ackerman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. As you suggest, Fabio, I want to make a distinction between the short-term problem of the coronavirus tragedy and the economic dislocation and destruction of millions and millions of people's lives in the cities and in rural areas in Peru. And what to do about that? And I think it's a short-term problem in the following sense. We now have vaccines. In 6 months or so, there will be hundreds of millions, billions of vaccines on the market. The only question is first, will the Peruvian government get or purchase 32 million vaccines? But even more importantly, will they have a system of delivering them in a non-corrupt fashion so that while of course rich people will be able to get the vaccines, the millions and tens of millions of people who are struggling for economic survival will also get them without paying a bribe. And that is a very important short-term problem, as well as providing financial assistance to these masses of Peruvians. But in 2 years' time, if the next government really works at this, we will be seeing recovery. How big, et cetera, it depends on the policy decisions made by the government. The corruption problem is serious and has to be confronted in a decisive fashion. But that is not what I want to talk about right now. We'll talk about that, Fabio, later on in the questions and answers. But right now I want to talk about the long-term problem, which is your constitutional crisis. Your constitutional crisis would have occurred even if there had not been a COVID crisis. Consider that what we have here is an election in 2016 by a centrist technocrat who takes corruption actually seriously. He then betrays his mandate and is then forced to resign and is replaced by a vice president who, of course, nobody thought was going to be president, who also took corruption seriously and was removed from office. We'll compare that later on, Fabio, with the removal of Donald Trump by impeachment and the failure there and the success here, and how to compare those two. Is one a failure and the other a success, or vice versa, or what to make of it? But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is that these two events, and then the 6 days and the 2 days that you've just been summarizing, have destroyed the confidence of the overwhelming majority of ordinary Peruvians in the future of their democracy. Both the centrists and the leftists and the rightists, so many, overwhelming numbers are alienated, as all of the demonstrations and the tragic deaths and the like suggest. The question, the long-term question is, can the framework of the 1993 Constitution be transformed in 2022 so that it will restore the hope of ordinary Peruvians in the future of their democracy, or their resignation to one or another form of military dictatorship, which we've experienced so many times in not only Peru's past, but in so many other Latin American countries. And that is the challenge. And that is the similar challenge that is going on in Chile, where once again, a president who is profoundly discredited is been obliged by the mobilized force of public opinion and marches in the streets to put on to have a referendum on a constituent assembly, which last month was affirmed by an overwhelming majority of Chileans. And that has generated a debate I should say, that I participated a little bit in, and will in the future. If anyone could tolerate my Spanish, you see, I'm very grateful to you that at this time I speak English, but I can destroy the Spanish language, but in a way that is intelligible. Except I speak Castellano, naturalmente, and to vosotros, etc., and so forth, not the kind of thing that passes for Spanish in Latin America. But to go back to the subject, the crucial point is that the debate running up to the election of delegates to the Constituent Assembly, which is going to be in April of the coming year, focuses on a crucial question. Shall Chile replace the presidentialist system of government and have a new constitution that's based on parliamentary government? And that is the question there the delegates, when they arrive, are going to struggle with. And my answer to that question is yes. And indeed, the case for a repudiation of presidentialism in Peru is even stronger than the case for repudiation of presidentialism in Chile, and that it is an imperative of the presently discredited Congress, which almost nobody has any confidence in. They should respond to this lack of confidence by under the Peruvian Constitution, propose a referendum immediately to the citizens of Peru on the question that the Chileans have debated and moved on to, which is not whether you should have a parliamentary system or a presidential system. Maybe at the end of the day, after many arguments, the Constituent Assembly will choose to change in important ways the presidential system because this one is not working. That's for you to decide, certainly not for me to decide. The only thing that I can contribute is that I actually know a good deal and I'm an outsider, so that I can compare your situation with, let us say, the situations presently occurring in Germany and the United States. Now, really, the public opinion in both countries is very similarly divided. And it is divided similarly to what's occurring, what exists in Peru. That is to say, let's focus first on Germany, but to make it simple, mathematically simple, I'm going to assume that there are 5 basic political positions and that there is one political party that represents each of them. So in Germany, there is about 15 or, well, let's call it 20 for purposes of simplification, voters who are voting self-consciously for the Alternative für Deutschland, which is the neo-Nazi party. There's also 20%, I'll call that extreme right. Then there is 20%, which are center right. They are the Christian Democrats. And then there are the centrists, who are some of the Christian Democrats and some of the Social Democrats. Then there are their center leftists. And then there are the strong socialists, the extreme leftists. That's basically very similar to what is true in Peru. You have, we can argue about the numbers, but you have about a fifth dedicated people to the, I'm looking here because I always get the popular force. We call that the extreme right. Then we have the extreme left, which is a substantial percentage, maybe 15 or 20. We don't, it isn't important. Then we have centrists. of the center left, the center, and the center right. Now, in Germany, who control? It's a parliamentary system. It is the center group party that is decisive for the government. Typically, they, meaning Angela Merkel, or her successor, form a coalition with the center left and the center right, which is 60–70%. And the others, the Alternative for Deutschland, the extreme right and the extreme left, they are in parliament, but they are the opposition. It's only if the extreme left or the extreme right got 51% of the vote that they would control the government. That's very hard to do, given this distribution of that I hypothesize. It's impossible, but I'm just giving it to you as an example. I'm not predicting what's going to happen in Peru in 10 years. But basically today, there is no single group that could command by itself 51% of the vote. Well, what that means is that Angela Merkel has not been impeached from office. No one has tried to say, you vote no confidence. There's been no effort to remove her in the same way as in what's happened in Peru over the last tragic years. And it's a tragedy. Similarly, her successor will have no problem, even though she doesn't, or he is probably going to be she, doesn't have nearly the kind of symbolic centrality as Angela Merkel. The challenge for them, for the center and center left, center right, will be to retain serious credibility which already exists in the democratic system. Contrast this with Trump. How did Trump become president in 2016? The same way that Fujimori almost became president in 2016. The way Trump became president was this: every modern constitutional presidential system has a two-stage process of determining who's going to be president. The first stage is let's just take Peru for a second. You have to get 51% of the vote in order to win. What happens is Kuczynski gets enough votes from the right-wingers who are scared about the left-wing challenge, so that Fujimori only gets 40% of the vote or something like that. I didn't look at the number, but something like that. So she has to run for a second round. That's where Kuczynski appeals to the left and says, we cannot allow this authoritarian system of 1990s to be restored with a military dictatorship, which is in the wings. Please, I know that you don't like me, but you hate her. And no. Right? And he won. Well, this is precisely the same thing that happened in the United States. We don't have, like you or Europe, you basically have a Gaullist French system. The first stage in the United States is not open to every voter with every candidate. Rather, we have a Republican first stage and a Democratic first stage. We had a one extremist right-wing person, Trump, both in 2016 and 2020, and 10 moderate center-right people. They actually got more votes in the Republican primaries than Trump, except they split it up into lots of little chunks. So he got the most votes, 25, 28% of all the votes in the primary. So he won with just by getting the extremists to back him. You see. On the other side, we could have had also in the United States, we could have had the extremist versus extremist, as you can in Peru in the second round. What we had was Bernie Sanders in 2016, who was, he's not a revolutionary, but he's a democratic socialist, which in the United States is extreme left. You see, because my left's right is relative to the, I'm not being a normative, I'm not telling people how they should vote. I'm just trying to locate each country on what voters believe. And in the United States, to be a democratic socialist is to be an extreme left. He was, this time around, he had a rival, Elizabeth Warren, who was also but she wasn't a democratic socialist, but she was an activist regulatory liberal, which is center left. And they fought with one another so that in such a way that in both 2016 and 2020, neither of them won, but rather a senior statesman or stateswoman who was a centrist, a moderate. So we had a right-wing extremist against a moderate. The first time, the right-wing extremist won. The second time, the right-wing extremist lost against a statesman moderate, which is just what happened with Kuczynski. Statesman moderate. I mean, once again, obviously there are millions of differences, but I'm emphasizing the similarities. That's where whatever I can contribute is the comparisons rather than the million differences in between Peru and the United States. That's a different issue.
Right.
So what we have here is something that I have developed these thoughts. There's something novel that I've done, but really I am building on the great work of two brilliant scholars of the last generation. I would say the greatest, the comparative constitutional thinkers of the last generation, Juan Lintz and Alfred Stepan, who, among other things, they also talked about other regions of the world, but they studied very profoundly the history of Latin American experience over the last 150 years, and emphasized what they called, I quote, the perils of presidentialism, how time and again an extremist or the threat of an extremist precipitated a military dictatorship. Time and again. And my question to the Peruvians, or the thing that I'm trying to raise here, is shouldn't you follow the precedent set by Chile just last year, confronting a very similar crisis, and consider whether the time hasn't come, after 150 years of disasters generated by presidentialism and appeals to the military to intervene when a president extremist is threatened or actually seizes power. Isn't it time to to learn something, not only from your own concrete experience, but to look at it as just another case of the tragedy of the past 150 years of constitutional experience in Latin America, and look to the future and say, let's follow Spain for all its troubles, Portugal, and Germany. Because if we just one more final glance to Europe, we have Macron in France, centrist. Who is he going to confront next time at the election? He's not going to get 51% because the left is not going to support him. He'll get 40%. And then he is going to confront a right-wing fascist candidate. Even though, and depending on how things work out in this struggle of COVID and the crisis of the European Union, she might win. Even though 51% of Frenchmen are not extreme right, but they will repudiate Macron. If there had been a German-style system, but for where Charles de Gaulle is ruling us from the grave in France. He destroyed the Fourth Republic, which was like the German-style system. Anyway, enough comparison, and what are your thoughts, Fabio?
Thank you for that brilliant presentation, Professor Ackerman. You have addressed very controversial points in Peru, and your knowledge of the Peruvian context is amazing. We will start now, for the sake of brevity, with the Q&A.
Sure.
So the first question is actually from Professor Abraham Siles, who is a PhD in law and professor of constitutional law in Catholic Law School.
Yes.
I still recall that in his course of constitutional crisis at Catholic University, we read your book before the next attack. So his question is the following. Is it legitimate for the government to declare that the COVID crisis constitutes a state of emergency authorizing unilateral action by the acting president and the army beyond the limits of the Constitution? That's the question.
Well, the question, I would reformulate it a little bit here. Well, first, I do think, let's suppose that the present discredited Congress did two things. One is that it organized an election for the provisional government for the next 2 years to handle the crisis. The other thing it did simultaneously was to call for a constituent assembly to respond to the long-term problem. What should be the governing principles of the provisional government? Tough question to answer. The existing Congress has no legitimacy to promulgate this. When we look, as I must confess, to the emergency provisions of the present 1993 Constitution as amended, it isn't obvious to me that there's a single clear answer. But that's really for serious Peruvian lawyers to resolve. So how to resolve this? Well, I would say that, yes, not whether the military should do it as opposed to the police and the, I mean, it's one thing to invoke the military in the way that Bolsonaro is doing. But if you're asking me whether there should be steps taken, especially given the status of central versus federal, regional, there's a real issue in, as I understand your constitution, the extent to which regional functions can be exercised on the national level and vice versa. Should this federalism issue, which is a very fundamental one, be understood to be a block to centralized short-term, meaning 2 years, efforts to actually provide funds to provide vaccines and to provide healthcare? Well, I think no. It shouldn't be understood as a block, and I don't think that the courts are at all plausible to resolve this question as a juridical matter, when all that it will do would be to delegitimate the courts, because then all the politicians will be blaming the courts for the terrible fact that people are dying in the streets. So I would be very much that federalism shouldn't be an obstacle, etc. However, it is of central importance, regardless of whether you choose a parliamentary system or a presidential system, to impose much more severe limitations on the use of states of emergency in general for the future. Because we've had many abuses of the emergency power in Peru in the past, under the 1993 Constitution, which is, after all, however, even though it has been amended, this is Fujimori's Constitution. This is not a constitution of a democratic renewal. This is Fujimori's Constitution. It's not, it is the law. But to say that it is a profoundly legitimate act of popular sovereignty, well, it isn't. The abuse of emergency power throughout Peruvian history, and as exemplified in the Fujimori Constitution of 1993, as amended, to be sure, is the problem, not the solution. If you're going to have presidential government, you should have one in which there is a tremendously constrained mechanism. And as one of your questioners was suggesting, the one that I suggest is that is not to rely on the courts so much, although the courts should play a role, but rather one which I call the super-majoritarian escalator. During the first 3 months, I'm making that 3 is nothing special, of an emergency, the presidential declaration has to be ratified by a majority in Congress, in Parliament. Then, in order to renew it, it has to be ratified by 60%. Then, in order to renew it a second time, it has to be ratified by 70%, and then by 80%, and then every 3 months thereafter by 80%. So that requires the members of Parliament who are not supportive of the president, even if the president has a majority, to recognize that there really is an emergency. And even though they generally have many interests in refusing to support the president, they will, the voters will vote against them next time if they say, no, there isn't an emergency when there is one. So that is an element of the emergency power, which I think has to be rethought under the Constitution of 2021, even if it adopts a presidential system. 2022, I'm being optimistic.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Professor Ackerman, for that thoughtful answer. Yeah, we analyzed in our course of constitutional crisis this proposal of escala creciente de mayorías adopted from the South African Constitution in Professor Siles' class. So now I'll tell you which is the second question, which is actually very, very interesting. As you may know, Article 113, literal 2 of the Peruvian Constitution expressly states the presidency of the republic vacates by his permanent moral incapacity declared by Congress. So the questions are, in your view, how should the term moral incapacity be interpreted? And second, do you think that Vizcarra's removal for moral incapacity under Article 113 was legitimate?
A constitution is not merely a few words. These particular words that you've cited, I think, came into the Constitution in 1882 or something. I mean, what year did they first arise in the constitutional text and then have been carried forward? This is not from 1993. This is from much earlier.
Much earlier. I'm not sure exactly which constitution because we have.
But I think it's the 19th century. I mean, but in any event, so what we have very, very typically, and what we will have again, if you write a constituent assembly, proposes a new constitution. Generally speaking, many of the old traditions are carried over without people thinking about them that much. After all, how long will this constituent assembly last? 4 months, 5 months? There'll be discussions at the same time that in the provisional government, provisional government is talking about COVID. This is going to be, it will be one of the basic principles of the Constituent Assembly is that no member of the government or parliament or the judiciary sitting members should serve on the Constituent Assembly. Otherwise, the Constituent Assembly will simply be a tool for the government. They'll say, we should have more emergency powers, even though, so we have, but if we have a Constituent Assembly, which is what I would call actually independent, then should it repudiate section, what is it, 103 or something like that, Article 103, or what provision of the
113.
113, that was close.
Yeah.
The 113A. Should it repudiate it? Yes. Yes. What it does is to permit especially if you have a single chamber. If you have a single chamber, and it's controlled by the opposition, which is the case right now, then the opposition can simply use 113A to remove the president at a moment of his vulnerability, political vulnerability, and cause chaos in actual public administration. This is bad. Now, I do believe, however, and so in contrast, you see, in the United States, what did we have? We had the opposition party controlling the House of Representatives, and it impeached President Trump for his genuine crimes. I mean, violations of the law. The idea that he would order his border control people to rip children away from their parents when they call. I mean, this is against, not only fundamental American constitutional principles, but clear statutory provisions. This is, a high crime and misdemeanor. There are a whole series of them. The Democratic controlled House didn't choose as many as they should have, in my judgment, but they chose some salient ones and then found him guilty of impeachable offenses. But then it went over to the Senate, which was controlled by the Republicans, who refused to hold the trial that was required of them by the Constitution. But once again, the words are one thing. It's the institutional system which is really fundamental to the Constitution. Now, I realize that there has been a shift from a single house to two houses in Chile. I believe that this is a mistake in a presidential system, because that means if you retain your presidential system, it will be relatively rare for the president to have his party in control of both houses. What does that mean? It means impasse. The president wants to enact some, not big change, but some sensible change. And one of the houses is controlled by his opponents and will oppose it because it's a sensible change. It's a sensible change. That's bad, because that means they're going to lose the next election because the president has done a good thing. Now, sometimes, of course, they'll be moved beyond partisan self-interest to the public interest. This does happen in politics. I've seen it happen. But what we have is an institutional system in which it will be, let's say, once every well, in the United States, in the last period, Barack Obama controlled both houses of Congress for 2 years and lost control for 6 years. He only had one house or no houses. This also was the case for Trump. He loses control, and therefore what happens? Unilateral presidential action against the law, and then challenging the Supreme Court to intervene. Very bad. What we want is a system, that's one of the advantages of parliamentary system, of a government which during most of the time is not so terrible. Peru has had some pretty good times, not recently, but has had some good times. If we look over the course of the 20th century, economically, socially, at the present time, just think about it. 95% of Peruvians are literate in the cities, and 80% are literate in the countryside. And by literate, I mean actually can read. 50 years ago, what was the numbers? Terrible. I'm not saying you have a long way to go to reach really the United States or France or Germany, a genuine, in the United States today, 40% of Americans have college degrees. Could you imagine that? 9% of Americans have a graduate beyond a bachelor's degree, a master's, or a doctorate. 1.5 million Black people in America have more than a college degree. This is incredible achievement. But this is also true in France, et cetera, and so forth. And it should be a big priority, in the future of a place like Peru. But one shouldn't forget that there's been a lot of progress along these lines. Even though in adverse circumstances in Peru. So my basic point is that during much of the time, which I call normal politics, there isn't some great crisis like COVID or something like that, or some armed rebellion going on. It's sort of normal politics, problem solving. And if we have this presidential system with 2 chambers, it's impasse time. It's conflict time rather than problem solving time. While in a parliamentary system, it's problem solving time. But you're next. I'm talking too much in answer to you, but it's a good question.
No worries, no worries. Actually, you have already answered another question, and it's great. So thanks for your wise analysis. I completely agree.